So it's lesson 6, and today our focus is on web application security. So we're going to look at authentication, authorization. We've got our music store is public. First thing we want to do today is kind of do a quick review of the security infrastructure that comes with our project. We're going to we want to get the registration and login working. We want to add some different user roles and set different access levels to different areas of the application based on our user role. We're going to want to talk about SSL and how do we enable SSL and why that's become more important than ever. Lastly, we want to look at OAuth sign-on, so enabling providers like Google, Microsoft, Facebook login to let people in with those credentials as well. So it sounds like a pretty ambitious agenda, but fortunately, the framework has pre-built so much of this stuff for us, we're pretty much just having to plug and play most of it. So I'll just open up my music store. We'll launch it without the debugger just to get it started. So I put a few visuals up for you on Blackboard. So this first one, this really kind of speaks to the architecture of how we're doing this. So when .NET first came out, there wasn't much infrastructure. We still had to do quite a bit of manual coding. They gave us some classes, but there was a fair bit of heavy lifting we had to do to actually implement those classes. So if I showed you code in some of my old .NET solutions, we had to do quite a bit of work in terms of authentication. So Microsoft's made had a number of evolutions over the years of this, and their best practice standard right now is using a framework they call ASP.NET Identity. So this has evolved out of a couple of earlier frameworks. So this has sort of been in the works for about 10, 12 years. The first iteration of this was back around 2005. So in here, this is our core, and this basically comes with a few packages that we already have installed in our application. Because if you remember, we set up the music store, we had the option to pick security, and we picked individual user accounts was the option. So you haven't done anything, but that added several .NET libraries into our application. So the core, this one is based on a library called Identity Core. Different interfaces. Up here, this is a middleware Microsoft developed called OWIN. It basically sits between the identity core and whatever our front end is, whether it's web, desktop, mobile, something else. So we've got this identity OWIN package, and then on the other end, we have an identity entity framework package, which is used for interfacing, obviously, with our SQL server. So these packages are already installed. If we look in the project references here, if I expand references, so the core is the main engine. The identity any framework sits between the core interfaces between the core and SQL Server, and the identity OWIN interfaces between the core and our front end application. Now we also got a bunch of other ones. We get the OWIN base libraries, and along with that, we get plugins. We get OAuth hooks for Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and Twitter already baked in. Obviously, there are other ones. So if we want to add GitHub auth or LinkedIn auth or something like this, we would just go and add that package into our solution if we want it. We don't have to write the code. Let's just plug into it. So they've kind of put these off to the side. They're not part of the identity core, but they integrate with it. They're kind of bolt-on modules. This identity core does something really cool. If we look at our database, just expand. You probably don't have this in yours yet. Notice when I gave you, we ran the script to populate the music store, we didn't actually have these tables. Does anybody have these tables that are prefixed with ASP.NET in their database if you look in Server Explorer, or do you just have the music store? You've got them? Anybody else have them already? It's fine if you don't have them because you're about to get them. And the way that the package works is really neat. Because here's the table structure that we get. gives us 5 tables. We're not really going to use these. We're primarily concerned with these tables. And when we plug the identity framework in, you'll notice in our application, right, we get register and login here. The way that the framework works is as soon as we create ourselves an account and click the register button, the framework actually looks and says, do we have these tables in our database already, yes or no? If we don't, it auto-generates those tables, and then it will insert your new account. If the table's already there, well, it just adds the account to the existing table. So we don't really have to set up this infrastructure. It's already here. We can customize it, and there's instances where we need to. Maybe we want additional fields in our users table, for example. They just kind of give us a bare bones table. So it doesn't store things like names, addresses, other fields, but we have the ability to then add them if we want. So go to your register page, click on your register link, create an account for yourself. Now keep in mind, you're going to need this account. We're going to set this up as an administrator account in a bit. So choose a password you're going to remember. Also notice it's got all kinds of standard rules. So if I try a 1-character password, it tells me it's got to be at least 6 characters. Okay, so I make it at least 6 characters. I'm just typing all lowercase characters. Automatically, it enforces strong password rules as well. Now, we can override these rules if you want it to be 8 characters, but this is baked right in, which is great. It saves us time from having to code this stuff. They need an upper, a lowercase, a digit, and a special character, at least 6 characters total. And now, it's recognized my login, and notice the register and login links are gone, and it gives me my username and log off instead. Am I working in the right project here? Hang on. Yeah, I am. Sorry, bear with me for a sec. There's a couple things I want to take out. I think I may have done a few updates by mistake in this project, which I want to do together with you guys. Odd. So if we look in the tables now, if you go back to your Server Explorer and refresh it, you'll now have these 5 tables. And we can have a look. My Server Explorer is not being very cooperative. So I'm going to examine my database using Enterprise Manager. Sorry, using Management Studio. This program used to be called Enterprise Manager years ago. So in my ASP.NET users table, which a bunch who obviously have taken my GitHub repo, but you haven't changed the connection string. It's rental space in my database for user account, $5 a week. Thank you very much, Ahmed and Alexander.
What did I do? Yeah.
And so you guys are in there. Okay. So it generates actually a string, random string as a user ID. It's not just a simple number, 1, 2, 3. Hashing of passwords is automatically done by the identity package.
Oh.
AMP is a salt value. Again, making sure we can lock accounts out if we want, and our username field. So if we want to add additional columns to this table, no problem, we can, but this is a starting point. We can verify that the login works if we log off and then put in, an invalid credential. It'll tell us, and if we put in a valid credential, log back in. So this whole scheme at all is set up and kind of ready to go for us. Just plug and play. So this is a good starting point. These packages do a lot of stuff for us. So you can see it's got strong password rules built in. If I try and register again, so if I try and duplicate that user account, tells me that user's already existing. So again, all the kinds of things we would expect. And if we actually take a look in here, so all this stuff is managed through the account controller. Package in, we get an account controller that has all these methods for login, register. So we can override these methods if we want them to work differently. And in our views, not only do we get register and login, we get all this other stuff too. The external logins, password resets, send verification codes, all baked into the package. So we can use whatever components as we see fit. So if we look here, notice there's also the logic already built in here to toggle those menu items depending on whether the user's been authenticated or not. When we're anonymous, we get register and login. When we're authenticated, we get these. So let's have a look at these for a minute. Let's see how and where this is happening. Bar, so we'll maybe open up our layout file and have a look at what's here. So in our layout, here's our nav bar. Right, we've added the store and store manager link. We don't actually see those links here. So the register, login, and then the hi with username and the log up. Obviously, that's got to come from that login partial. That gets stuck on the right side of our nav bar. So we haven't really looked at that before. So if we go to shared and open up the login partial. So here are the two different sections, right? This is the section if they're logged in. This is the section if they're anonymous. And here's the condition that's being checked. So it references the ASP.NET Identity package, and it simply evaluates the request object if it's an authenticated request, yes or no. So that's that little property, request.is authenticated, that'll tell us if the user is anonymous or if they're signed in. So that's a good start. Our first step in security is really talking about authentication and identity. Who is this user? That's kind of step one. And then step two, once we know who the user is, our next step really moves beyond authentication to authorization. What access level, what is this user allowed to see and do in the application? So we see this all over the place. In Blackboard, we can look at the same page, right? But I have this drop down here. So even though we're viewing the same content, you don't get that drop down because that revolves around authorization. We're both authenticated users with valid credentials to see the resource, but I have additional permissions as an instructor. So the first thing we're going to want to do, eventually where we're going today is the store manager should be private section. All of those views should only be available not only to someone logged in, but someone who's logged in an administrator role. So we'll kind of do this in 2 steps. First, we want to make it so that this link is hidden until a user logs in. And then when these things change, this should change as well. This link should become visible. As soon as they log out, that link goes away. So we'll start that anybody who can log in can see that link. Once we do that, we're going to take the account we've just created for ourselves, and we're manually going to have to create, if we look at the, we get this roles table, but the identity package doesn't predefine any user roles, right? Because the user roles really depend on the purpose of the application, right? Is it administrator, customer, manager? Is it student, faculty? What is it? You know, is it player, coach? Obviously, those roles depend on what the purpose of the database is. So we're going to have to define a couple roles in here. We're going to create an administrator role for ourselves, and then we'll also create a customer role for anybody who's shopping the music store. They still create an account, but obviously they're not an administrator. They can't change things in the store. And then we're going to need to put our account into the admin role in this table. We have this user roles table, which is really simple: user ID and the role ID. And that's a many-to-many relationship. So one user can be in many roles, and one role can have many users. So that's basically a simple junction table. So once we put ourselves as administrators, we're then going to change it so not only do you have to be authenticated to see that, but you also have to be logged in as in an administrative role. Just having a regular account isn't going to be good enough to give you access to the store manager. So we're going to look at dealing with that link, and then we're still going to have to go and secure all of the views, because we can show or hide the link, but then somebody can still just browse to one of those store manager URLs directly, right? So we're going to have to actually authenticate that. So we're going to do that. We're going to enable SSL, and then we should have time to do the third-party social logins as well. So showing or hiding this link's pretty easy, right? We already have a condition up here that toggles some of those menu items. So we can actually do the same thing. So in our layout, we can simply wrap this link in the same kind of if statement they've used on the login partial. So above this, now there's a couple ways we could do it. I'll show you both methods. Both are valid. So our request object, we can simply check the is authenticated property. So we're going to move that link inside of that condition. So only when the user is authenticated do we display that link. That's one way of doing it. So if we save now and go back and refresh, if you're logged in, the store manager link should stay there. If you open in a different browser or a private window where you're not logged in, that link should be hidden. So I'll just try this. So I'm logged in here. So I still have access to Store Manager because I'm logged in. But I'm going to go back, I'm going to go to my home page in a private window. So I'm not logged in here, and notice my Store Manager link isn't here. I've got register login and I don't see the Store Manager. I can still get here though, so we're going to need to deal with that. Oops. If I knew the path or I bookmarked it, I could get there. So we haven't actually really secured this yet. Step one is hide the links to get there. But then we're going to have to actually make sure this is secure next. So we could check request.is authenticated. There is another option that basically will do the same thing. Tyrell?
When you go there by the top, will still allow you to edit and do everything?
Oh, yeah. Whoops. Yep, I got full access. So all I've done is hidden the link. We've done nothing in so this page is not aware that we have that logic in the nav bar. There's no connection, right? It's sort of like this. Let's put it this way. So the link is kind of like me saying to you, go to my office in A155 and eat all the Mars bars out of the second drawer, right? You can go and do it. If I don't tell you where my office is, you could still find my office and go eat the Mars bars. You just have to find it yourself, right? But I haven't locked the door. So I need to do both. There actually are. Okay. So we've hidden the directions, but it's still wide open. There's actually nothing protecting this yet. So we can do it with request.isAuthenticated. We can also do it this way, same feature. We can actually check our user object instead. We can check user.identity.isAuthenticated. It'll give us the same result. So here we're checking for a specific user object. And the second, we're just checking the HTTP request. Both of them have that isAuthenticated property. We won't notice any functional difference in the two.
So neither are better or worse than.
Not really. We're actually going to need to change it after anyway, because for starters, we're just checking whether the user's logged in or not. We actually need to go one level beyond that, though, because we're going to have two types of users, administrator and customer. The way it is right now, anybody who creates an account is going to see the store manager link. So that's really not sufficient, right? Because remember, authentication is about identity. Do we know who you are? Yes or no, basically. But then authorization is, now that we know who you are, what are you allowed to do? So we're kind of doing it one step at a time. So first, we're just checking, are you anonymous or are you authenticated? So either of these objects, they both have the isAuthenticated property. You can use either one. They're equivalent, in fact. So now let's take our account. We're going to take the account we have. We're going to create ourselves as an admin. We're going to put ourselves in the administrator role in the database. And then we're going to create a second account. So we'll now have two. One that's an administrator and one that's just a regular user or customer. And then we're going to want to change the logic here so that not only they have to be authenticated, but they have to be in the administrator role. So I have to do a couple things in the database. So the first one is, if you don't have this query window open yet, you just want to run a query. Well, because what we need to do is we need to get the user ID of the user account you just created. So you can just easiest way is just right-click your ASP.NET user roles table and choose select top 1,000 rows, or you can just run a select star from ASP.NET users. Either one, you want to get the list so that we've got your ID. And actually, we'll come back to this. We'll need that ID in a minute. We need to set up the roles first. So we'll come back here. So you can either do this all in one script tab, or you can open multiple tabs. It really doesn't matter. I'll maybe just do it all right here. But first, we're going to add two roles. So two simple insert lines. We're going to insert into ASP.NET roles. The ID is not numeric in that table. It's not auto-assigned. So we'll manually have to provide values. The first one is ID1, and the role is administrator. And our second insert, we'll just insert a value of 2 and customer. Later on, we build our checkout. When those customer accounts are created, we'll save them into the customer role. Because customers are going to need access to things like viewing order history. Right? So when someone logs in, we need to know, are they administrator? Do they get to the site dashboard? Are they a customer and they should go see like their customer portal? So I'll just highlight those two commands and execute them here. Just highlight those lines, click execute on your toolbar. Tells me my insert ran with no errors. If I want to check it, I could just right click and run a select query, and we've got 2 roles now. So now we need to take our user ID and insert that into the user roles table with role ID of 1. We're making ourselves an administrator. So I'll just run my select query again here. Just highlight the select query that Management Studio wrote for me. So I'm going to grab the ID of my account. So most of you probably only have 1 user. I'm generously sharing my table with a few of you for low fee. Sure. Here, I can just bring this down. So just copy the user ID from your users table, or ASP.NET users table. And now we're going to make ourselves an administrator. So for the moment, we're doing this manually in our database. If we wanted to be able to create administrators from within the website, we would have to build our own set of views to do this. I'll show you what this might look like. But typically, to get started, we probably need 1 admin account to get set up somewhere. And then 1 administrator could then theoretically create other ones through the website. But we have there's no automatic facility for that to happen. We'd have to create it. I'll just highlight my last insert. So I'm taking my user ID as generated by the identity package, and I'm putting myself into an administrative role. So I'll just highlight that last insert and execute it. So now I have an account that I'm an administrator of. So in yesterday's class, somebody said, well, obviously doing this through the database isn't ideal. If we want to create additional admin accounts, wouldn't it be easier if we could do this through somewhere in a private area in the application? For sure. This is what that might look like. Well, I have an admin account here. So as an administrator, I can now, we've used scaffolding, I can now add, edit, and delete other administrators.
So it still has to start from the database?
Yeah, we had to create 1 account first. So we wanted to create 1 account first in the database. And now I can create others. So this is still calling the same method. We didn't have to write our own method. We can still call the register method that's already in the controller. And we just basically took a copy of the register view that gets created. So now we can create other ones. So now we have an administrator account. We probably should register a separate account on here as well so that we can test the difference between logging in as an administrator and logging in as a regular user. So I've created 1 account for myself with my college email. I'm going to log off, and I'll just register another account. I'll just call it, customer @ I'll use the same password so that it's easier to remember the 2 different credentials. So this will create another account. I'm not going to put this account into any specific role. They're not an administrator. Doesn't have to be a real email address, doesn't matter. So now I can log in with either my Georgian account or my customer, kind of fake customer account here. Now notice I'm logged in, so I get the store manager link again. So now we need to change our little if statement and our logic here, because it's not sufficient to be logged in to get that link. We should have to be logged in, but we should also have to be in an administrator role.
When you don't register it, is it still going to the customer table you made or no?
No, it's actually, they're not actually in any role right now. So if we look at, it's a good question. If I look again at my user roles table, at the moment, that user isn't even in a role. We'd have to modify the register page to actually add anyone who signs up. We'll probably have to do that when we do the shopping cart and checkout. If they create an account when they check out, we're going to have to add before we save. Or after we save them and generate their ID, we then need to grab the ID and stick them in here as role ID 2. So we'll have to do that part manually. But we'll leave that. Doesn't really affect what we're doing today, but we'll need to do that later. So if we go back here, we want to change the if statement. We don't actually have to change very much. We're still going to use the user object, right? Because now it's not about the request in general. We need to inspect the particular user account. So if I delete what's here, which of these am I going to choose? And what's going here? You got it. Good. So not only does the identity package set up all this infrastructure, but when somebody logs in, it automatically attaches any roles that are in the ASP.NET user roles table onto that user. And it's stored globally, so as they travel through the site, we can at any point inspect what role is this user in. And it can be multiple roles. It's not simply one user, one role. One user could have multiple roles. They all automatically get attached when unsuccessful login.
Could you pass in a list?
No, this checks one at a time. I'll show you what it looks like though, because I'll show you an application. I think I have the source code on this machine. May even still be online, although wow, it's old. I think it's 11 years old and it looks terrible, but it has, I built it before there was ever ASP.NET Identity. So we did the whole security model ourselves. It's too complicated for even describe. I'll have to show it to you. And I'll come to your question of how we would check multiple roles. So this basically just gives us a Boolean. So it's one role at a time. It doesn't accept an array or a list. So now if I refresh, I'm logged in as customer. I'm not an administrator, so my link goes away. If I log out and back in with my admin account, I'm an administrator, so I get the store manager link. So now it's checking not just authentication, but authorization. Now that we know who you are, what is your role? So this user.isInRole, this function's been around for a long, long time. Let me see actually if I still have access to this, even if the site's even still online. They have the most complicated authentication model I've ever seen. The site may be offline now, but I may have the source code. Oh yeah, I do. Let's see if I can show you what some of this looks like. Yeah, this was so crazy. This was written in Visual Basic. Here, dated March 29, 2006. I think the domain's offline now, the server's offline. So the way this site works, anybody here have a snowmobile? Ride a snowmobile? So this is the organization that manages all the snowmobile clubs. And the way their application works is they have about 15 different tabs in the website. And every user on the website can have one of 3 choices for every different tab. No access, you can't see it. You have read-only access, you can see it, but all the forms are locked and the save button's disabled, or you can modify. But then within that, they have 4 levels of permissions, from administrator to manager to district manager to user. So one person can have different permissions in 15 different tabs at 4 different levels. So here's kind of how it looks. So it's VB, but the code's, so here, this was the top level. So if they can modify passwords, if they're not in that role, this section's invisible. Otherwise, they have this link. So we had to do this. So here's how you would check 2 roles at once, William, coming to your question. Okay, so they're at the district level. If they can't do this, and they can't do this, so you'd have to use that is-in-role function in a series of conditions. Do. So then it was just madness. This entire thing was crazy. It would have been much, much easier if we had ASP.NET Identity, but we can still only check the roles one at a time.
Would be no method to just have an array of all the permissions and then a array through each one check in the database? You
could, except the conditions in each case, had to check different things. So if this is true and that's false, so I had to actually, but theoretically you could, yes. You could put the permissions in an array and you could loop through them if you wanted. Yeah, I guess they finally took that site offline. It was about time. It's 11 years old, almost 12 years old. So now we've based this link around our, not just authentication, but our user role. Our store manager, however, is still actually public. Tyrell and Keith can still go get the chocolate bars out of my second drawer, right? Because now you know they're there. So this is all still public. They could not make this any easier for us to secure. Let's go to our store manager controller. Now we have the ability in the controller to either protect the entire controller, so all the methods and all the views, or we can specify if something should be public and not others. We can either specify certain functions as requiring authorization, or we can require the whole thing as authorization and override that in any individual methods that don't require authorization. That's what we want to do. So what we'll do is we're going to secure all of the store manager, except we'll override that on the details page, because on the details page, they can't change anything. So we can make that page public and everything else private. Want to see how complicated this is? Type authorize. Now, if we type authorize, we use that decorator, and that goes up here above our class. Put it in the wrong place. So this controller, now what this will do, this will work, but even our customer can log in. This is just checking authentication only. So as long as the user's authenticated, they'll still be able to get in. This is only going to block an anonymous user. We can try this. So put this little authorize annotation above our store manager controller. And now maybe having 2 browser windows is a good idea, or 2 separate browsers. We can try logging in one as our administrator and the other as our non-administrator account. And then, so I've rebuilt, which will kill my login anyway. So I'm going to log out, I'll be anonymous, and I'll try and get to the store manager now. So my link is gone, I'm anonymous. If I try to go to store manager now, it kicks me to the login screen. One of the other useful features of this is it appends on a return URL. So oftentimes I'll set up my applications to email me when these redirects happen, because then I can see what pages people tried to access. Where if I see that hackers are probing to see where they can get in, it'll email me this and I know what pages people are trying to get in that they don't have permission to. Now, it may just be that their session timed out, but that's kind of useful. So now we should be able to log in with either account. And not only will our link come back, but the pages are accessible to us. So it works as an administrator. I'm going to log in here with my customer account. My link is hidden. Because I'm authenticated, I can still get here, which we don't want. So we're almost there. That authorize annotation is a start, but we need to be a little more specific with it. So we've used an empty authorize tag. We can specify this. Who, which roles, or which usernames are we going to allow? Now, William, this could be a list. So if we have multiple roles that are allowed in here, it would be administrator, comma, that could be a list. So now if we, whoops, and I missed my closing bracket, so it'll fail. Now if we try this again, our admin account will have access, our customer account does not. And then we can override this rule in our details view. Now this should log me out of both because I've recompiled. So I'll probably have to log back into both accounts. Oh, actually kept my login. So as an administrator, I have access to the store manager. But now as a customer or any non-admin user, I'm blocked. So that was super easy, right? Set it up in the database and add authorize roles equals. So that was all we need. Now, again, we would put it here if the vast majority or all of the methods in the controller should be private. If it's a mix, we can add this same decorator rather than adding it, annotating the controller itself. We would just annotate the individual methods. So any method that has some kind of authorization, we would just move that tag above the method. So if I want to override it in my details, I'll just pick my details method here from my little drop down at the top. So if we want to make this one public, now we've got an override. There's a few different ways we can do it. I just want to check how I did it yesterday because I forgot, but I liked how we did it. Bear with me for a second. Do it the same way. Yeah, we'll use allow anonymous. So if any view we want to make public, we can just allow anonymous users access. Now, right now, there's no direct link to that page, but if a user happens to get to it, or we add a link, that page should now be public. If they click, though, the edit or delete link on the details, they're going to get kicked to the login screen if they're anonymous. Sorry, so on.
I mean, for anonymous, as an example, so the database can see, like, everyone can see.
Yeah, it will make it public.
And like, if I want to set just like users that have an account can see instead.
Then we would just change it to just say authorize.
Like,
So authorize means any authenticated user. But now if I go to one of my details links, if I open it in a private window where I'm not logged in, we won't see a username. It should allow me to access the details page only as an anonymous user. Let me throw it in another browser entirely. There, so I can get here, I can't get anywhere else. So if I try and go back to my list, it'll reject me and take me to login. If I try and edit, so I'd probably take those links out. If this page was going to be public, I'd probably just get rid of those links. So everything in the controller is secured now, except this one view. So we have access at the granular level to apply whatever authentication and authorization rules we want. So yes, if we wanted it just to be customer, we would just use authorize, or it would be authorize roles equals customer. If it was customers only and not administrators, if administrators couldn't see that page, they were logged in. So it's almost like a global and local variable, right? We can declare a global rule up here, but if we add a different rule to an individual method, it will override the global rule in the class. But that's a good question. Thank you for raising that issue. Any other questions about what we've done so far? Okay. So the other things I want to do today are we'll want to enable SSL, and we'll have to have a bit of a discussion about that. That was a big topic of conversation yesterday. Security in general, SSL in particular. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll look at enabling some of these OWIN packages, and hopefully we can enable Google, Microsoft, and Facebook. Hopefully we can enable all of those providers. It's going to involve some setup in the developer console for each through those portals. It's maybe a little early, but why don't we take our lunch break here? We'll come back at 12:30 and we'll enable SSL, and then we'll look at enabling those other providers. Be right with you, Dan.